But in the midst of this chaos, a new threat emerges, the Soviet Union. As tensions escalated during the Cold War, NATO launched large-scale military exercises like Operation Mainbrace in 1952. These cracks within NATO are impossible to ignore. Take Turkey for example. This blatant defiance of NATO's collective efforts has left the alliance fractured. The ongoing Russia-Ukraine war has only exacerbated these challenges. Okay, so NATO is at a breaking point.
What is NATO and why was it established in the first place?
Internal divisions, financial imbalances, and shifting global priorities are tearing apart the alliance that once stood as the cornerstone of Western security.
On the 4th of April 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty was signed 4 years after World War II ended.
But to understand how we got here, we must first take a look back at NATO's extraordinary history. A story born from the ashes of World War II and forged in the crucible of the Cold War. Picture this. It's 1949 and Europe is still reeling from the devastation of World War II.
And the world's largest military alliance was born.
Cities lie in ruins, economies are shattered, and the fear of another global conflict looms large.
12 nations, including the US, UK, Canada and France, agreed to form a defensive alliance to counter the Soviet Union.
But in the midst of this chaos, a new threat emerges, the Soviet Union. Stalin's iron grip was tightening across Eastern Europe as he was establishing communist puppet governments.
A group of communist states, including its most powerful member Russia, in what was known as the Cold War.
Enforcing Soviet control through secret police, political purges, and the suppression of opposition. Notably demonstrated by the 1948 Czechoslovak coup. Western nations soon realized that without unity, they could be next.
NATO says its purpose is to guarantee the freedom and security of its members through political and military means.
In response, 12 nations came together in April 1949 to form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization or NATO, to stand as a bulwark against Soviet aggression and cement a bond between Europe and the United States.
NATO members are also backed by an arsenal of nuclear weapons.
At NATO's heart lay a powerful promise, Article 5, which declared that an attack on one member was an attack on all members. It was this unity that allowed NATO to prove its might from the very beginning.
That guarantees the security of its now 32 member states under Article 5 of its founding treaty.
This essentially means that if one NATO ally is attacked, then all NATO allies are attacked.
During its early years, NATO's resolve was tested in dramatic fashion.
NATO doesn't have an army of its own, but the alliance can draw on the armies, navies and air forces of its members in a crisis.
One of its major achievements came in 1950 when it coordinated military support for South Korea after the outbreak of the Korean War, marking a significant test in collective defense against communist expansion.
Only 5 years after the end of the Second World War, the major nations of the world are once again up in arms. As nuclear weapon-fueled Cold War tensions grow between East and West, the Korean Peninsula will play host to its first major hot conflict.
As tensions escalated during the Cold War, NATO launched large-scale military operations like Operation Mainbrace in 1952, showcasing its unified strength and preparedness to counter Soviet aggression.
In the south, the former exiled provisional government president Dr. Syngman Rhee announces the Republic of Korea in August. In September, former anti-Japanese leader and Soviet Army Major Kim Il-sung announces the Communist Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north.
In 1983, NATO's deployment of Pershing II missiles in Europe despite mass protests was a bold move that pressured the Soviets to engage in arms control negotiations, leading to the historic INF Treaty. These milestones defined NATO's success in preserving peace and deterring conflict amongst its most challenging era. As the Cold War unfolded, NATO evolved into a powerhouse. It became the backbone of the West's defense strategy.
In 75 years of European history without a war, that's the ultimate expression of a successful alliance.
Its nuclear deterrence kept the Soviets at bay, while its integrated military structure ensured seamless collaboration among member nations. Moments like the fall of the Berlin Wall epitomized NATO's success, marking the triumph of democracy over dictatorship.
Thousands of East Germans came across the border today, perhaps more than 100,000, so many that border police lost count. And at every border crossing, thousands of West Germans there to say welcome.
For decades, NATO stood as the shield of the Western world. But with the Cold War ending, the alliance lost the clarity of its original mission. Without a single adversary, NATO struggled to redefine itself.
How strong is NATO? Among European members especially, there are some glaring weaknesses.
And today, it faces growing internal rifts, competing interests, and shifting global priorities that threaten its very existence. These cracks within NATO are impossible to ignore. Take Turkey, for example. A nation that was once NATO's eastern flank now seems increasingly aligned with its adversaries.
Turkey's President Erdogan took his NATO allies by surprise last month when he said he would block Finland and Sweden's membership bids, accusing them of harbouring people linked to the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, which is listed as a terrorist organisation in both countries.
In 2019, Turkey purchased Russian S-400 missile defense systems, directly defying NATO's objections and undermining its security protocols.
In 2019, Turkey bought the Russian S-400 missile defense system despite vehement objections of the United States and other NATO members.
To make matters worse, Turkey's military operations in Syria have targeted Kurdish militias, the same groups the United States relied on in its fight against ISIS. This duality has left NATO questioning Turkey's commitment. Yet, Ankara continues to wield considerable influence, often using this strategic location to block critical NATO initiatives such as Sweden's bid for membership.
Its relationship with many NATO allies has why should Turkey remain in this military alliance?
Turkey, however, is not the only member creating discord. Hungary, under Viktor Orban's leadership, has openly defied NATO's stance on Russia. While the alliance has worked tirelessly to isolate Moscow, Hungary has maintained close ties with it, securing exemptions from EU oil embargoes and expanding its nuclear energy projects with Russia. This blatant defiance of NATO's collective efforts has left the alliance fractured and questioning its ability to maintain unity in the face of mounting challenges. And then there's France. French President Emmanuel Macron's infamous statement that NATO is brain dead wasn't just a headline-grabbing remark.
French President Emmanuel Macron went so far as to say NATO was experiencing brain death.
It was a reflection of France's dissatisfaction with NATO's reliance on US leadership and its inability to address Europe's unique security needs.
Macron criticized what he saw as a complete lack of common strategy within NATO.
France's frustration with NATO aren't new. Decades earlier, France withdrew from NATO's integrated command structure, emphasizing the country's desire for strategic independence. Macron's push for European strategic autonomy is simply the latest chapter in a long-standing tension between Paris and the alliance. Adding to these tensions are the financial disparities within NATO. The United States shoulders nearly 70% of NATO's defense spending, while many European nations fail to meet the alliance's requirement of allocating about 2% of GDP to defense.
What we're seeing at this stage is a renewed clash between the former President Donald Trump and NATO, all because the former president said recently that he would encourage Russia to do whatever the hell they want with NATO countries that are not respecting the 2% of GDP in terms of defense spending.
Germany, a key NATO member, only spends about 1.57%, and countries like Luxembourg contribute less than 1%.
Only 11 members of NATO respect the 2% of GDP defense spending. Looking at how European countries have spent when it comes to defense, it does show that the biggest economies, France, Germany, but also Italy and Spain, are not respecting that threshold.
Under Donald Trump's leadership, the United States has demanded European nations increase their defense spending to about 5% of GDP, sparking heated debates.
This comment as well from Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, who said that any suggestion allies will not defend each other undermines our security.
This financial imbalance has bred resentment on both sides, with the US questioning why it should bear the lion's share of Europe's security costs, while European nations push back against what they see as excessive demands. The ongoing Russia-Ukraine war has only exacerbated these challenges.
There are also conflicts between Russia and NATO on the cyber level. An investigation published in 2023 revealed the Vulcan files leak and the existence of hacking centers working for the Russian government.
European nations have funneled billions of dollars into Ukraine's defense, but this has come at a steep cost. Energy prices have soared, economies across the continent are struggling under the strain. Countries like Germany and France are increasingly prioritizing their own security frameworks, advocating for Europe to manage its defense independently of NATO. Meanwhile, Hungary and Turkey are calling for peace talks with Russia, creating a dark divide between members pushing for confrontation and those seeking compromise. At the same time, NATO faces competition from emerging security frameworks across the world.
Russian President Vladimir Putin viewed the eastern expansion of NATO as both a threat and betrayal of a purported promise.
Take the AUKUS pact between Australia, UK and the US, signaling a clear shift in Washington's focus from Europe to the Indo-Pacific. As China's influence grows, the US has doubled down on countering Beijing, leaving NATO and Europe feeling sidelined.
I think it has a lot to do with this kind of competition between China and the US. And the EU, as a staunch ally of the US, should actually try to strike a balance.
China's rise isn't just a challenge for the US. It's pulling NATO's attention away from its traditional focus on Europe. If Washington is prioritizing the Indo-Pacific, where does that leave NATO? The signs of NATO's decline are everywhere. Internal divisions, financial disparities, and shifting priorities make it increasingly difficult for the alliance to function as a cohesive force.
In Putin's eyes, it was a breach of trust that justified Russia's attack on another country. He made that clear in an address to the nation 3 days before Russian troops invaded Ukraine.
В Киеве давно провозгласили стратегический курс на вступление в НАТО. Да, безусловно, каждая страна имеет право выбирать собственную систему обеспечения безопасности, заключать военные союзы. Другими словами, выбор способов обеспечения безопасности не должен создавать угрозы для других государств.
If NATO were to collapse today, the consequences would be profound. Europe's defense would become fragmented, with nations scrambling to build their own security frameworks. Poland and the Baltic states, which rely heavily on NATO for protection against Russia, would find themselves very vulnerable.
Well, I think our biggest mistake in NATO over the years was after we expanded, not because we were rushing to get close to Russia's border. These countries wanted protection, and we brought them into NATO, but we did not close the gap. We left a gray zone between NATO's eastern border and Russia's western border.
This power vacuum left behind by NATO's absence would embolden adversaries like Russia and China, accelerating their aggressive pursuits. Without NATO's deterrence, the United States would struggle to contain China in the Indo-Pacific or respond effectively to a potential invasion of Taiwan. Such a scenario would have catastrophic implications, not just for Europe but for the global balance of power. NATO was born out of necessity, thrived on unity, and achieved unparalleled success during the Cold War. But today, its internal divisions, financial imbalances, and shifting priorities threaten to unravel the alliance. If NATO collapses, it won't just mark the end of an era, it will reshape the global order in ways we can scarcely predict.